The morning sun filtered through the sleek windows of EliteCorp, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors. The hustle and bustle of 1,000 elite minds swirled in the background. The hum of whispered conversations, the occasional click of high heels against the floor, and the rustling of expensive suits. Everything screamed perfection. But amidst the pristine environment, one figure remained invisible. Tommy, a young assistant whose name few knew and even fewer cared to remember. With each passing hour, he moved unnoticed through the corridors, an invisible cog in the massive machine that was EliteCorp. While everyone around him flaunted their wealth and power, Tommy's worn-out shoes, frayed jacket, and tired eyes told a different story. A story of quiet desperation, of a boy trying to survive in a world that cared little for his existence. His work was unnoticed, his efforts were unappreciated, but no one saw the weight he carried. Behind his tired gaze lay an unspoken battle, a hunger to rise above his circumstances, to be seen, not just as a nameless employee, but as someone capable of more. But there was no one to hear his voice, no one to acknowledge his worth. He was invisible, just another body in the office, another assistant to fetch coffee and file papers. Then there was Mr. Harrison, the boss who was both feared and admired by everyone in the company. The one who walked with an air of unshakable authority, whose sharp eyes could pierce through the walls of any office, whose voice could freeze anyone in their tracks. Mr. Harrison was the embodiment of power, the one everyone sought approval from, and the one who never had a second thought about the little people like Tommy. "Tommy, get in here!" Mr. Harrison's voice boomed through the hallway, cold and demanding. There was no warmth in his tone, just pure, unrelenting superiority. Tommy's heart skipped a beat. He was used to this by now. The summons always came with an underlying tone of impatience, a demand for perfection that Tommy could never quite live up to. But today, something was different. Something in the air felt heavier, more suffocating. Tommy swallowed his nerves and walked into the office. As he entered, Mr. Harrison didn't even look up from his desk. He was too busy reviewing reports, as if Tommy were nothing more than an afterthought. "I need that report on my desk in 10 minutes, not a second longer. You understand?" Mr. Harrison said, his eyes never leaving the paperwork. Tommy nodded, his throat tight. "Yes, sir." But as Tommy turned to leave, the weight of Mr. Harrison's gaze followed him, as sharp as a blade. There was no empathy in his eyes, no recognition of Tommy's hard work, just cold indifference. Tommy's stomach twisted. He had felt this before. The sting of being overlooked, of being less than nothing. The office around him continued its dance of luxury and power, but Tommy knew the truth. He was just a pawn, a nameless face in a sea of corporate giants. But today, something was about to change. As Tommy walked back to his desk, he didn't know it yet, but this would be the day his life took a turn he never saw coming. The day everything he thought he knew about the world would unravel. The day he would finally be seen. The steady hum of EliteCorp's high-powered office faded into the background as Tommy sat at his desk, his eyes glued to the screen. His fingers moved in rhythm, typing up the final details of a report he knew had to be perfect. Every keystroke, every word was a reminder of the mountain he had to climb. He wasn't just working on this report, he was fighting for his place in this world, a world that often overlooked him, that had already decided he didn't matter. Around him, the office was alive with activity, but none of it touched him. The polished marble floors reflected the gleam of expensive suits as people moved quickly, their voices filled with importance. Tommy's desk, tucked in the corner of the room, felt like a prison cell. A small, insignificant space surrounded by the grand machinery of EliteCorp. To the others, he was invisible, just another employee who barely registered on the radar. But to Tommy, every moment felt like a test, a chance to prove his worth, even if no one noticed. His fingers trembled slightly as they hovered over the keyboard. The pressure had been building for weeks now, an impossible workload, unreasonable demands, and, of course, the ever-present shadow of Mr. Harrison, the one person in the entire office who had never been able to see past Tommy's worn-out jacket and tired eyes. To Harrison, Tommy was nothing but an obstacle, a nuisance, a reminder that not everyone fit into the polished, perfect world of EliteCorp. Tommy closed his eyes for a brief moment. He needed a break, just a second to breathe. The weight of the task at hand, the endless cycle of working to prove himself, was suffocating. He grabbed his coffee mug, hoping the warm liquid could steady his nerves. It had been a long day, and the caffeine was supposed to give him the push he needed to finish the report. But as he stepped away from his desk, his breath caught in his throat. Across the room, he could see Harrison walking toward him, a look of impatience already on his face. The moment he saw that cold, calculating stare, the anxiety in Tommy's chest grew tighter. He had no choice but to stand there, frozen, as Harrison approached. "You're still on that report, Tommy?" Harrison's voice cut through the room, sharp and dismissive. Tommy swallowed hard, the words feeling like a punch to the gut. "Yes, sir. Just finishing it up now." His voice was barely above a whisper, but it felt like the weight of the entire room was pressing down on him. Harrison didn't respond. He didn't need to. The silence was enough to speak volumes. Tommy's fingers gripped the coffee cup a little too tightly. He needed this to be perfect. But in the back of his mind, the voice of self-doubt whispered, "You're never enough. You'll never be enough." As he walked toward his desk, the worst possible thing happened. His elbow nudged a stack of papers. A report, his report. The papers tipped over and began to fall, cascading like a slow-motion nightmare. His heart skipped a beat as he reached for them, his movements frantic. In that instant, the inevitable happened. The coffee sloshed over the side of his mug, splashing across the pages. The ink began to smear, the words becoming a mess of indistinguishable blotches. His breath caught in his throat. Everything he had worked for, ruined. Tommy stood frozen, staring at the coffee-soaked report in disbelief. His hands trembled uncontrollably, his chest tightening with the realization of what had just happened. He didn't have the time, the energy, or the heart to fix this. It was beyond repair. And then he heard it, the voice that had haunted him for as long as he could remember. Mr. Harrison's voice filled with contempt. "Tommy, what did I tell you about being careful?" The anger was unmistakable, a thunderstorm rolling in. Tommy flinched, instinctively stepping back. Every inch of his body screamed for him to shrink, to disappear. But there was nowhere to hide. His heart pounded as Harrison stormed over, his steps sharp and purposeful. The office had fallen silent, all eyes turned in his direction, and in that moment, Tommy's face burned with shame. He could feel their eyes, their judgment, each one a weight pressing down on him. I'm so sorry, Mr. Harrison," Tommy stammered, his voice barely audible. He reached for a napkin, trying to salvage what little he could of the ruined report. But Harrison wasn't interested in excuses. "This is unbelievable," Harrison hissed, his voice low and seething. "You had one job, Tommy. One. How can you be so careless?" The words sliced through Tommy like a blade. He wanted to apologize, to explain that he was trying, that he was doing his best. But the words never came. Instead, he stood there, paralyzed by the weight of his own failure. "You're a disgrace," Harrison continued, his voice growing louder, sharper. "How do you expect to succeed in this company if you can't even manage the simplest tasks?" The derision in his words was unmistakable, the contempt so thick it could be cut with a knife. Tommy's hands shook as he stood there, the humiliation and shame suffocating him. He had given everything to this job, worked late nights, sacrificed weekends, and yet none of it mattered. In the eyes of Mr. Harrison, he was nothing. But then the final blow came, delivered with chilling finality. "Tommy, you're fired." The words hung in the air, sharp and unforgiving. Tommy's heart stopped. The room spun around him, but the only thing he could hear was the steady thrum of his heartbeat, pounding in his ears. Fired. After all he had done, all he had sacrificed, he was fired. For a moment, Tommy couldn't move. His mind was numb, his body frozen. He had been so focused on proving himself, on clawing his way up from nothing, that he never saw this coming. And now, standing in front of Mr. Harrison, he realized that no matter how hard he tried, it would never be enough. Harrison's gaze was cold, final. "Get out of my office, now!" Tommy's hands shook as he gathered his things, trying to hold back the tears that threatened to spill. The whispers started as he walked past his co-workers. They didn't even look at him. No one cared. The world continued, indifferent to his failure. As he stepped out into the cold air, the reality of it all hit him like a punch to the gut. He had been fired. But in that moment, Tommy wasn't sure what hurt more, the loss of his job or the realization that, to Mr. Harrison, he had never mattered. The door slammed behind him, and the world outside felt like a completely different place. Tommy stood there, his mind racing, his heart aching. But little did he know, this day, this humiliating, heart-wrenching day, was the beginning of something much bigger than he could have ever imagined. The moment of his deepest defeat would soon become the catalyst for a life-altering revelation, a shift that would change everything. The streets outside EliteCorp were a blur, a chaotic mix of neon lights and hurried footsteps. But for Tommy, everything seemed to slow down. The cold winter air bit at his skin, but it couldn't pierce the numbness inside. His mind raced, replaying the last few moments in the office. Harrison's harsh words, the sting of being fired, the disapproving gazes of his colleagues. Worst of all, the crushing weight of realization. Everything he had worked for was ripped away in an instant. Tommy's feet moved, but it felt like he was walking in a fog, each step dragging him further into failure. The city, once full of promise, now felt cold and uncaring. His hands shoved deep into his pockets did nothing to stop the shivers running through him. Today, he wasn't just invisible to his colleagues. He was invisible to the world. There was one place he could still go, one person who might understand: his father. Tommy's home, a modest house tucked between two tall buildings, stood in stark contrast to the ambition and wealth that had overtaken the city. As he approached the door, fear and uncertainty gripped him. What would his father say? How would he react to Tommy's failure? He had tried so hard to be the son his father wanted, the son who could prove hard work mattered, that even someone like him could rise above. But now, standing at the threshold of his father's study, Tommy wasn't sure he could face him. His hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob. The weight of the last few hours pressed down on him, suffocating him with every breath. But there was no place left to hide. His father needed to know. The familiar scent of leather-bound books and rich mahogany filled the air as Tommy entered the study. Richard Grant, his father, sat behind his large desk, eyes fixed on papers. The room felt colder than usual. The silence stretched on, thick with unspoken words. Tommy felt the weight of his father's gaze as it shifted toward him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard's voice broke the silence, deep and commanding. "Tommy, what's the matter?" His eyes narrowed. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Tommy swallowed hard. "Dad, I was fired today," he said in a rush. "I let them down. I let you down." Richard's brow furrowed, his expression unreadable, but Tommy could see something deeper. Concern, maybe regret. Richard leaned back in his chair, his eyes searching Tommy's face. "You were fired?" Richard repeated softly, disbelief clear in his voice. "What happened? I thought you were making progress." Tommy's throat tightened. "It was just one mistake. A small thing, but it cost me everything. Mr. Harrison, he humiliated me in front of everyone. He said I was a burden, that I'd never make it. He fired me just like that." The silence between them grew heavier. Tommy couldn't look his father in the eye. Richard's face remained hard, but there was a flicker of something deeper, maybe regret or concern. Richard stood up slowly, the sound of his chair scraping against the floor breaking the silence. He walked over to Tommy and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You know," Richard said, his voice softer, "I've always known this would be hard for you. The world out there doesn't care who you are or where you come from. It doesn't care about your dreams or efforts, but it does care about your resolve. It cares about how you rise after every fall." Tommy's heart skipped a beat. "What are you saying?" he asked, confusion and anticipation building inside him. Richard's voice took on a new intensity. "I'm saying you've been hiding something, Tommy. Something I've known for years, but I've never told you. You see, son, I didn't just build this company from nothing because I was lucky. I built it because I understood the value of resilience, and you've been living under a shadow of your own making." Tommy's breath caught. What are you talking about? Richard's gaze softened, emotion flickering in his eyes. I'm saying you've been playing a part all along, a part that doesn't match who you really are. Tommy's confusion deepened. I don't understand. Richard paused, his voice steady. Tommy, the truth is, you've been working in my company for months now, and I've never told anyone, not even the employees, who you really are. Tommy's heart pounded in his chest. What? You mean? Yes, Richard said firmly, interrupting him. You're my son, Tommy, the heir to EliteCorp. The words hit Tommy like a lightning bolt. He stood frozen, unable to process what had just been revealed. He had always been the invisible worker, the one who toiled in the background. But now, standing before his father, he realized everything had just changed. His identity, his worth, his purpose had been hidden from everyone, even from himself. The man who had fired him, humiliated him, had no idea who Tommy truly was. And now Tommy knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden hue across the towering glass walls of EliteCorp's headquarters. Inside, the atmosphere was tense, a silent undercurrent of whispers filling the air. Something big was about to happen. Richard Grant, the man who had built EliteCorp from the ground up, walked through the hallways with a commanding presence. Employees who once walked past him without a glance now stopped in their tracks, unsure whether to approach him. The murmurs grew louder with each step he took. Did you hear? Mr. Grant is here. What's going on? Richard's sharp eyes scanned the office, his mind already on the conversation he was about to have. Tommy walked beside him, his heart racing. He had never imagined this day would come, the day he'd confront the man who humiliated him. Richard's voice broke through Tommy's thoughts. Are you ready, son? Tommy nodded, but his voice trembled. I don't know if I'll ever be ready for this. This is about more than just you and me, Tommy. This is about respect, Richard replied calmly, his words carrying the weight of years of experience. They reached Harrison's office. Tommy's breath grew shallow. Richard knocked once, a deliberate sound. Inside, they heard muffled movement. Come in, came Harrison's voice, impatient and clipped. Richard opened the door with calm authority. Harrison, seated behind his desk, looked up in surprise, his eyes narrowing when he saw Richard standing there, uninvited. What is this? Richard, what are you doing here? Harrison asked, irritation creeping into his voice, barely masking the anxiety. I've come for my son, Richard replied firmly. Harrison's expression shifted, confusion clouding his face. Your son, he repeated, disbelief clear in his voice. I don't understand what you're... Tommy stepped forward, his heart pounding. I'm Tommy, he said, steady despite the adrenaline. Tommy Grant, your assistant. Harrison's face contorted in shock. You're... What? He stammered, struggling to comprehend the revelation. No, I didn't... The room felt suffocating as Tommy stood tall, the power dynamics shifting in an instant. Harrison, once the authoritative figure, now looked fragile in front of Richard and Tommy. Richard's voice sliced through the tension. You've been treating my son like a servant, Harrison. I've let it go for too long. But now you've crossed a line. Tommy's pulse raced, but his voice remained firm. You fired me. I was nothing to you. But now you see who I really am. The air was thick with tension as Harrison's face drained of color. He darted his eyes between Tommy and Richard, realization settling in. I didn't know, Harrison muttered, voice trembling. I never meant for this to happen. Tommy felt satisfaction swelling within him, watching Harrison unravel. The man who had humiliated him, who had tossed him aside, was now powerless before him. Richard stepped closer, his authority unshaken. You will leave this office immediately, Harrison. And when you will leave with nothing. You no longer have a place at EliteCorp. Harrison's mouth hung open in disbelief. You can't do this. I've been with EliteCorp for years. Not anymore. Richard's voice was cold, final. You've made your bed, and now you'll lie in it. The room fell silent as the weight of Richard's words sank in. Harrison stood frozen, defeated. Tommy felt an overwhelming sense of release, The years of anger and humiliation began to ebb away. The power had shifted. Richard turned to Tommy, his gaze softening. "Let's go, son." Tommy nodded, his chest swelling with a mix of relief and anticipation. For the first time, he felt truly in control. As they walked out of Harrison's office, the whispers followed them. But this time, Tommy wasn't the invisible assistant. He was Tommy Grant, the son of Richard Grant, and the world was about to see him for who he truly was. Harrison stood frozen, his face ashen, mouth moving but no words escaping. His mind raced, but the realization hadn't caught up to him. The man he had dismissed, humiliated, and fired in front of the office, Tommy, was the son of Richard Grant, the very man who owned EliteCorp. And yet Harrison couldn't grasp it. He couldn't understand how he had been so blind. Richard stood beside Tommy, his presence calm but imposing, his gaze locked on Harrison with quiet fury. The tension in the air was thick. Every second stretched into eternity as the silence weighed down on Harrison, the office walls closing in on him. Harrison's gaze darted between Tommy and Richard, his disbelief turning to panic. I don't understand," Harrison stammered. "How was I supposed to know? He didn't look like—" "Enough!" Richard's voice cut through Harrison's frantic words, sharp and steady. There was no room for excuses anymore. Harrison's fate was sealed. Tommy stepped forward, his voice steady with newfound authority. "You never saw me for who I really am," Tommy said, his words calm but filled with power. "You saw me as an assistant, a nobody. You treated me like my worth was based on my position, but now you see the truth." Harrison's shock was evident. He stood paralyzed, his career, his authority crumbling around him. Richard, still composed, stepped closer. "Tommy has more integrity in his little finger than you've had in your entire career," Richard continued, his voice cutting through the tension. "You didn't just disrespect him, you disrespected this company. You have no place here anymore." Harrison's body trembled, and he took a step back, his mind spinning. The reality of what was happening hadn't fully sunk in yet. He had underestimated Tommy, and now everything he had built was slipping through his fingers. Richard's words were final. "You're fired, Harrison, effective immediately. Pack your things and leave. Don't make me say it twice." Harrison's face went pale. His eyes darted around, desperately searching for an escape. Just moments ago, he had been in control, but now he stood like a man trapped. The very empire he had once commanded was now slipping away. I didn't know," Harrison stammered, his voice breaking. "I didn't know who he was. I swear I didn't mean—" But it was too late. His words fell flat. He had crossed the line, humiliated the wrong person. Tommy's gaze never wavered. "It's too late for apologies. You can't take back what you've done," Tommy said, his voice quiet but resolute. "You treated me like I was disposable, but you were so blinded by your own arrogance that you never saw who I really am." Richard glanced at Tommy, a rare moment of pride flickering in his eyes. "You've done well, son. You've proven yourself more than anyone could have imagined." Tommy's chest swelled with pride, not from his name or his father's wealth, but from his own journey. He had risen above the doubt, the humiliation. He wasn't just the assistant anymore. He was Tommy Grant, the heir to EliteCorp. The power dynamics had shifted. The man who had once wielded all the power stood exposed, broken. Harrison's shoulders slumped as the weight of defeat consumed him. There was no fight left in him. He had lost everything. Richard's voice broke the silence. "Leave, Harrison. Don't come back." Harrison turned, defeated, and walked out of the office, his head down. The echoes of his footsteps faded as the door swung shut behind him, a finality that reverberated through the building. Tommy stood still for a moment, processing everything that had just happened. He had faced his fears, endured the humiliation, and now he had claimed his place. It wasn't about wealth or titles. It was about the respect he had earned, the strength he had found within himself. Richard placed a reassuring hand on Tommy's shoulder. "You're ready now, Tommy," he said quietly. "It's time to take the reins. EliteCorp is yours." Tommy nodded, his heart swelling with pride. The world had changed. He was no longer the invisible assistant. He was Tommy Grant, the rightful heir to the empire. The transformation was complete. Tommy had emerged from the shadows, from the depths of self-doubt, and now he stood in the light. The world would never see him the same way again. The atmosphere inside EliteCorp had shifted. What was once a world of cold, calculating ambition now hummed with a subtle, electric change. Tommy stood at the center of it all, no longer just a humble assistant, but the son of Richard Grant, the heir to the empire. The employees who had once ignored him now regarded him with a mix of respect and curiosity. The air was different. The respect was palpable. Tommy stood beside Richard in the middle of the office floor. Employees who had once dismissed him now watched him closely, their eyes full of new understanding. Whispers spread quickly, but they no longer carried judgment. Now they spoke of admiration, awe. The underdog had risen, and everyone could see it. Tommy's heart raced as he stood tall, feeling the weight of the change. His posture had straightened, his shoulders squared. He wasn't the boy who had slouched in the background anymore. Now he was someone to be reckoned with. Richard's voice broke through Tommy's thoughts. Remember this, Tommy. Power is only as strong as the respect it commands. You have that respect now, but don't forget what it took to earn it. People will follow a leader who stands by his values, no matter the cost. You've done that today. Tommy nodded, meeting his father's eyes. The respect he had earned wasn't just from the employees. It was from Richard, the man whose approval he had sought for so long. But more than that, Tommy had earned his own respect. He had become the leader he had always wanted to be. As Tommy looked around the office once more, he saw something he hadn't seen before. Unity. Employees who had once worked in isolation now moved with a shared purpose. The power dynamics had shifted, not just because of his name, but because of the integrity he had shown. The respect he commanded now was more than just a title. It was a reflection of who he had become. The office felt alive with possibility. Tommy realized this was just the beginning. This was the start of something new, not just for EliteCorp, but for him. He wasn't just the heir to an empire. He was its future. Tommy stood taller now, feeling the weight of his responsibility, but also the excitement of what lay ahead. He was ready to lead with integrity, respect, and the strength of character that would set him apart from everyone else. Richard gave him one last look, a look of quiet pride. You're ready now, Tommy. I'm proud of you. Go and make this company your own. And with that, Tommy took his first steps forward, not as the invisible assistant, but as the leader he was destined to be. The room parted for him. The employees, once indifferent, now watched with respect. He wasn't just part of the background anymore. He was at the forefront. The future was his. Tommy walked through the halls of EliteCorp, his head held high. By his side was Richard, his father, and the weight of the past few hours settled in. Yet Tommy no longer felt the crushing doubt or fear that had once defined him. The office around him was quieter than usual, but it felt different now. There was a change in the air, something tangible. The employees who had once passed him by with indifference now acknowledged him with respect. Tommy could feel it. The power dynamics had shifted. He wasn't the invisible assistant anymore. He was Tommy Grant, the future of EliteCorp. His confidence had grown. His place within the company was no longer up for debate, and the world he had once feared now seemed like a place of opportunity. Today wasn't just about Harrison, Tommy. Richard's voice broke through his thoughts. It was about understanding that true leadership comes from respect, not dominance. You've earned that respect today. Tommy absorbed his father's words. He had learned more than he expected today, more than just how to stand up to Harrison. He had learned that power, real power, came from humility, integrity, and earning respect rather than forcing it. Leadership wasn't about making others bow to your will. It was about guiding them with strength, honesty, and character. As they stepped out of the building, Tommy felt lighter. His role at EliteCorp had shifted from that of an assistant to a leader. But the most profound shift had been within himself. The lessons he'd learned weren't just about running a company. They were about understanding himself, knowing what he stood for, and leading with honor. Tommy looked around at the now changed office. What had once felt like a cold, intimidating place now seemed to buzz with potential. The shift in office culture was undeniable. The fall of Harrison had broken old patterns, and now respect and integrity were at the forefront. Tommy's rise wasn't just about titles. It was about transforming the company into something better. He glanced at Richard, who walked beside him with pride. "The road ahead won't be easy," Tommy said quietly, "but I'm ready." Richard gave him a nod, his expression filled with silent approval. They had come a long way together, but Tommy now understood something crucial. True leadership wasn't about power, it was about influence and respect. As they walked into the future, Tommy knew he was ready to take on the challenges ahead. He had learned to lead, to face adversity, and most importantly, to never underestimate the power of respect.